She grabbed my waist in a crowded street and the city stopped breathing. I had walked out of the wrong building at the wrong time, coffee in hand, moving too fast to notice the woman stepping out of the black car at the curb. I stepped into her path. The coffee went sideways. Her hand shot out and caught me before I fell, palm flat against my waist. And for one suspended second, I was pressed against the most feared woman in this city, while her security detail watched with the blankness of men deciding whether I was a threat or a disaster. She looked down at me. Dark eyes, deep and still, like water where light does not reach. One word, careful. It rearranged something in my chest I cannot put back. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. Her name was Selene Vale. If you lived in this city long enough, you knew the name the way you knew certain intersections, where accidents happened too often, not because you had been in one, but because the shape of the place told you it was only a matter of time. Selene Vale was 41 years old, the founding partner of Vale Capital Group, and the woman responsible for acquiring and restructuring 17 companies in the last decade, 4 of which had been sold at prices that made the financial papers use words like ruthless, precise, and inevitable in the same sentence. She did not grant interviews. She did not attend industry galas unless she owned part of the building. She had been photographed leaving a government hearing 3 years ago with the expression of someone who had already read the outcome before the testimony began, and that single image had circulated for a year because nobody could decide whether she looked powerful or frightening or both. The answer, as I now had direct physical evidence to confirm, was both. I was 26 years old. My name is Ren Calloway. I was a junior analyst at a mid-sized architecture consulting firm on the 14th floor of the very building Selene Vale had just exited at street level after what I would later learn was a 40-minute acquisition meeting. I had been at that firm for 11 months. I made enough to cover my rent with approximately $40 to spare each month after the student loan payment cleared, and I owned a coffee maker that required negotiation. I was, by any reasonable metric, not a person whose path intersected with Selene Vale's unless someone had made a clerical error in the universe's filing system. But the universe had apparently made one that morning. And now she was standing on a midtown sidewalk holding my coffee-drenched forearm, while her palm still rested at my waist, and her driver stood 3 feet away looking at me with the studied neutrality of a man who had witnessed many things in this job and had opinions about none of them. I should explain my thought process in the following seconds because it is not flattering. My first thought was that I was going to be arrested. Not because I had done anything criminal, but because when a woman that powerful looks at you with that particular quality of attention, the instinct of the body is to assume consequence. My second thought was that there was coffee on her coat. Her coat was charcoal gray wool, cut long, clearly not a thing that had been purchased with coffee spillage in mind. My third thought was that she was still touching me and had not removed her hand. "I am so sorry," I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. "I wasn't watching where I was going and I stepped right into you in your coat. I'm so sorry about your coat." She looked at the coat, then at me. Something moved in her expression that I could not categorize. It was not anger. Anger I would have recognized. This was something more like assessment, the way you look at a problem you had not anticipated and decide whether it requires attention or dismissal. Her hand left my waist. The absence of it was more noticeable than the presence had been, which told me something about myself. I immediately filed away to examine later and then avoided examining. "Are you hurt?" she said. The question startled me. I had been preparing for dismissal, for the polished indifference of someone wealthy enough to simply walk away from inconveniences. I had not been preparing for a direct question about my physical well-being delivered with the same tone a surgeon might use when asking whether you could feel your fingers. "I'm fine," I said. "I'm completely fine. You caught me before I actually fell, so." I stopped, because the sentence was dissolving into nothing useful. She looked at my arm, where her hand had been a moment ago. The skin there still registered the pressure of her grip in a way that was difficult to think about directly. "The coffee is yours," she said. I looked at the pavement, at the cup rolling toward the storm drain, at the dark spreading stain on both of our shoes. "Yes," I said. "I'm sorry." She opened her mouth and then closed it. Something that might, in another face, have been a beginning of a smile crossed hers and was replaced with neutrality before I could confirm it. She looked at her driver, exchanged something wordless with him the way people do when they have worked together long enough to have an entire private language of glances, and then she looked back at me. "Your building," she said, meaning the one I had just exited. "Yes, 14th floor." She nodded once. That was the end of the relevant information apparently. Her driver opened the car door. She stepped toward it and then paused, one hand on the door frame, and looked over her shoulder at me with an expression I would spend the following 3 weeks replaying. "Next time," she said, "look up from the phone." Then she got in the car and the door closed and the black sedan pulled away into traffic and the sidewalk resumed being a sidewalk, and people walked around me without comment, because in this city, a woman standing motionless on a pavement with coffee on her shoes was not worth a second glance. I stood there for approximately 45 seconds. Then I walked back into the building, took the elevator to 14, sat down at my desk, and stared at my monitor without reading anything on it for 6 full minutes. My coworker Dara swiveled in her chair. "You look like you've been hit by a car." "Not a car," I said it mostly to myself. "What?" "Nothing." "Do we have a client called Vale Capital?" Dara stared at me. "Why?" A pause. "What happened? Do you want to tell me what actually happened just now?" I told her. To her credit, Dara did not laugh immediately. She waited until I finished, and then she laughed for a long time, and then she said, with the fond concern of someone who had watched me catastrophize 11 months of small disasters, "You are the only person in this firm who could collide with Solange Vale on a public pavement and somehow make her pause before getting into the car." She just told me to look up from my phone. "People don't get sentences from Solange Vale," Dara said. "They get looked through. That isn't a sentence. That's a verdict." She turned back to her monitor. "Either she found you amusing or you made a terrible first impression that she is going to remember. Or both. Probably both." She pulled up a spreadsheet. "Go drink some water." I did not think about it again for 3 days. That is not entirely true. I thought about the pressure at my waist in the elevator on the way down to lunch. I thought about the word careful twice in an after-dinner bath that I am not going to detail further. I thought about her eyes each time I walked out of the building onto the sidewalk for the next 72 hours and looked automatically in the direction of where the car had been. But I did not allow myself to think about it in any organized or intentional way, because organized, intentional thinking about Solange Vale was obviously the beginning of a road that ended badly, and I had enough going on. The thing I had enough going on about was my work. 11 months into the job, and I had slowly become aware of a gap between the work I could do and the work I was being given access to. I was not bad at my job. I was, if I am being honest, with appropriate modesty, quite good at it. I had a particular facility for reading the energy efficiency profiles of building structures and identifying places where materials allocation had been made for aesthetic reasons at the cost of long-term maintenance economics. It was a niche skill. It was also exactly what the firm's largest retained clients cared about. But I was junior, and junior meant I supported the senior analysts, which meant I prepared the materials that other people presented in the rooms where decisions got made. I had been preparing those materials for 11 months, and I had not once been in one of those rooms. My manager was a man named Theron Park. He was not unkind. He was, however, the sort of person who had developed an elaborate internal architecture for why things were the way they were, and saw no reason to revise that architecture just because the data suggested it could be improved. He liked me the way people regard a well-functioning appliance. He told me I was doing great. He never once asked what I thought about the project I was researching. Dara had been there 4 years. She had 3 times my experience and twice my titles, and she had been passed over for a senior position twice. She had the posture of someone who had learned to take up exactly the amount of space that was offered and no more. She was brilliant. She was also exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with workload. I had been thinking, in the back of my mind, about whether this was the right place for me to be. Not loudly, not in a way that had produced any concrete action. Just the low, continuous hum of a question that has not been answered. Is this it? Is this where the work I can do gets to actually happen? Or is this one of those places that is going to need me to make myself smaller indefinitely to function here? I was thinking about this on the morning of the 4th day when I walked out of the building and nearly stepped into the same black sedan parked at the curb in almost exactly the same spot. I stopped. The sedan was there. I was there. The sidewalk between us was approximately 3 feet of fate, with poor timing. The passenger window came down. Solange Vale looked at me from inside the car with an expression that contained something I had not been prepared for, which was recognition without surprise, recognition without surprise. The quality of someone who had made a note of me, filed it, and was now encountering the file in her own hand. "You work here," she said. Not a question. 14th floor, yes. She glanced at the building, then at the coffee cup in my hand. "You brought another one." I looked down at the cup. I couldn't think of an appropriate response. I had, in fact, brought another coffee, a different cup from a different cart, because the original had gone sideways 4 days ago and I had not yet readjusted my morning routine to account for whatever this was. "You went back to the same corner cart," she said. "The one on 54th. I had. How had she known that? The question must have shown on my face because something shifted in hers, something that was the precise opposite of the professional neutrality she had been wearing a moment ago. It was there for less than 2 seconds and then it was gone. Observation, she said. The cart has a specific cup design. I passed it this morning. Oh, that was all I managed. She looked at me steadily. What is your name? Ren Calloway. She repeated it the way she had said careful, briefly, exactly, in the manner of someone storing it somewhere specific. Then the window began to go back up and I thought that was the end of it. The second and final Solange Vielle encounter of my life. A thing I would tell someone at a party someday and they would say, "That's incredible," and I would say, "Yes, it was," and that would be that. Ren, she said, through the narrowing gap of the window. I looked up. Look up from the phone, she said again. The same words as before. And then the window closed and the car pulled away. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment. A woman with a stroller moved around me with the patience of someone accustomed to people stopping in inconvenient places. I watched the car until it turned the corner. Then I went upstairs and sat at my desk and tried to do my job, which I did badly for approximately 2 hours while thinking about the way she said my name. Dara noticed. Of course, Dara noticed. She waited until lunch. You look like you got hit by the same car twice. It parked again. Dara put down her fork. She asked for your name? She didn't ask. She asked. I paused. She asked. There is a meaningful difference between those two sentences, Dara said. Yes, I know. She was quiet for a moment. Her salad went untouched. Ren. I know. Solange Vielle does not make small talk on sidewalks. She does not remember junior analysts at mid-sized firms. She definitely does not park the car twice. I know. Do you want me to be direct? I looked at her. Whatever she wants from you, Dara said carefully. It is going to be complicated. I am not saying that to be discouraging. I am saying it because I know enough about how the world that woman operates in works, and the people who go into it thinking it will be straightforward tend to come back out slightly reconfigured. I nodded. I appreciated the directness. I also understood that Dara was speaking from a place of genuine protective concern and not from any information about Solange Vielle specifically, just from the accumulated experience of watching people navigate power differentials with insufficient preparation. I wasn't planning on doing anything, I said. Good, Dara said. She picked up her fork. That's good. I was not planning on doing anything. This was factually accurate. I had no plan. What I had was a name lodged in my chest, and the memory of one hand at my waist and 2 sentences that were still turning over in my head, with the obstinate repetition of something that cannot be silenced by willpower alone. The third encounter happened 11 days later and was entirely my fault, though not in the way you might expect. I did not manufacture it. I did not contrive to be in the right place. What I did was accept an invitation to a panel discussion on sustainable urban development hosted by a think tank in a building I walked past every day, and then discover 15 minutes into the event that one of the 3 panelists was Solange Vielle. I had not known she would be there. Her name was not on the promotional materials I had seen, which I had not looked at closely enough, which was precisely the kind of oversight that happens when you register for an event because the topic interests you and not because you are tracking the appearance schedule of a woman you have been trying reasonably not to think about. She was seated at the far end of the panel table when I arrived and found a seat in the 3rd row. She was in conversation with the moderator, angled away from the room. I had a full 4 minutes of watching her before she turned and looked across the audience with the professional sweep of someone taking attendance, and then her eyes found mine in the way that things that have been tracking each other sometimes do, not searching, but arriving. She did not change expression. She looked at me for 1 second, and then looked back at the moderator. But the second had weight in it, and the moderator's question that followed landed in the air and dissolved without reaching my ears, because I was managing the physical consequence of having been seen. The panel itself was, objectively, good. The other 2 panelists were intelligent people with interesting positions. Solange spoke twice in the first half hour, both times with the concision of someone who has decided that an argument is only worth making if every word in it is doing work. She said nothing decorative. She did not fill silence. When the other panelists said things she disagreed with, she let the disagreement sit in the air without announcing it, and then addressed it 3 sentences later, with the precision of a correction that had been sharpened before deployment. The audience watched her the way audiences watch weather, with attention, with a particular quality of held breath. I took notes. I do not entirely know why. The event was not for work. I had nothing to produce from it. But my hand moved across my notebook anyway, because taking notes was something my hands knew how to do when the rest of me was in over its head, and right now the rest of me was significantly over its head. At the midway break, people moved toward the refreshments table at the back. I stayed in my seat and looked at my notebook. The third row had read as a reasonable distance when I chose it. It now seemed, in retrospect, like exactly the distance from which a person could be identified clearly without being lost in the general mass of the room. I sensed her before I saw her. That sounds like something I am inventing in the telling, and I want to be clear that it is not. There is a particular alteration in air pressure. I am not speaking metaphysically. I am speaking about the purely physical reality that a tall person moving through a stationary crowd displaces the space differently, and something in my body registered it before I looked up. She was standing at the end of my row. She had a glass of water in one hand, and she was looking at me with that same quality of attention, contained and precise, like she had already decided on a destination and was confirming the address. "You registered this morning," she said. "Your name was on the list." I looked up. "You checked the list. I review attendance for events I participate in. Is that standard practice? For this kind of event?" She said it without inflection, which made it impossible to determine whether she was being entirely truthful or slightly not. She looked at the notebook in my lap. "You take notes at a panel discussion." "It's a habit." "From what?" She glanced at the notebook, not reading it, just noting its existence with the attentiveness she seemed to give everything. "Architecture consulting." I pause. "Materials analysis, mostly. Sustainable load efficiency." Something in her expression shifted. The barest adjustment, a shift in focal length. She looked at me differently for a fraction of a second. The way people look when information they filed as incidental suddenly reclassifies itself as relevant. 14 floors up, she said. "They're in Park's team." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. There was the ambient noise of the room around us, the soft collision of conversation and glass, and the particular low hum that happens when 100 people are networking in a contained space. Inside that noise, the silence between us had a texture. "You're not going back for the second half," she said. It was not a question. I opened my mouth to say that I was, actually, planning to, because the second half included a discussion on modular retrofitting that was the reason I had come. What came out instead was, "Are you asking me to leave?" She looked at me. Something happened in her eyes that I recognized as the thing that had been happening every time she looked at me directly. This quality of arrival. The quality of someone who had been navigating towards something and kept finding it in my face. "There is a bar 2 blocks east," she said. "It is quiet on Thursday afternoons, if you have an hour." My heart did something with no apparent regard for my plans. I thought about Dara's voice at lunch. "Whatever she wants from you, it is going to be complicated." I thought about that. Then I said, "I have an hour." The bar she had mentioned was a place I had walked past without entering, the kind of establishment that announces its own selectiveness through the complete absence of signage. Inside it was dim and close and populated by 3 other people who all appeared to be having conversations they had been having for years. A bartender who knew Solene's name and her order glanced at me once, measured something he chose not to announce, and set 2 glasses down on a table near the far wall. She sat with the particular stillness of someone for whom stillness is an active choice rather than the absence of movement. Her coat was off. Beneath it she wore a dark silk blouse, the collar open at the throat, a thin chain catching the low light. She looked, in this context, different from the sidewalk, and different from the panel table. Not softer exactly, more complete. I sat across from her and told myself to say something competent. "I'm not normally this quiet," I said, which was not the competent sentence I had been reaching for. "You are exactly this quiet," she said. "You have been since the first time we spoke." She picked up her glass. "It is not a flaw. Most people speak to fill the gap where a thought should be." I looked at her. "You've been paying attention." "I pay attention to everything." She said it without ego, as a simple statement of operational fact. Then, after a pause that had weight and direction to it, "I have been paying attention to you specifically since the pavement." Something in me went very still. I kept my face arranged. Years of being the youngest person in professional rooms had given me a version of the composure she carried, smaller and less polished, but present. "Why?" I said. She turned her glass once on the table. "A habit. Something she did when thinking, you moved wrong." "Y started." "Everyone on that pavement was moving with destination," she said. "They knew where they were going and they were going there. You moved like someone who had been told where to go and was questioning it mid-route. It caught my attention before you stepped into the car's path. I absorbed that. You noticed the quality of my movement before I ran into you. I noticed things that don't fit the pattern." She looked at me without apology. "You don't fit the pattern of someone who should still be a junior analyst 11 months into a job." I blinked. That was specific. She set her glass down. "Vale Capital Group completed a review of your building's tenant contracts 2 weeks ago. It is not coincidence that we share a building. We are in the process of acquiring the development firm that occupies floors 20 through 23. "Oh," I said it slowly, rearranging the last 3 encounters in my head with this new information threaded through them. Your firm is not part of the acquisition. Theron Park's practice is too small and too specialized to integrate. She looked at me. But the work your floor has been producing on the Meridian retrofit brief is interesting. I had our analysts pull the project files. You pulled our project files. The public filings. What is accessible under standard industry review? She held my gaze. Your name is not on any of the reports. But the analytical framework for materials cost projection in the 40-page annex is not the work of Theron Park or his senior associates. I said nothing. It's yours. I said nothing for longer. The 40-page annex is the part that 3 separate senior consultants at 3 separate firms told us represented a novel approach to retrofit viability modeling. Solena's voice had not changed in volume or temperature. None of them attributed it to anyone below a senior analyst level, because nobody with that methodology would be operating below a senior analyst level. She paused. And yet here you are, still preparing materials for other people to present. I looked at the table. The particular specific shame of having work that you know is good and having nobody in your immediate professional orbit willing to acknowledge it was not a feeling I had named out loud before. Hearing it named by someone else, accurately and without decoration, produced a sensation in my chest that was uncomfortably close to relief and close to something more vulnerable than relief. I looked back up at her. How long have you known? Since the day of the review, 10 days ago. So when you asked my name, I already knew your name, she said. From the filing, I asked because I wanted you to know I was asking. There is a difference. The room was very quiet around us. The other conversations had softened into background texture. I was acutely aware of the distance across the small table, the way the light from the low sconce caught the line of her collarbone at the open collar, the fact that she was looking at me with full and undivided attention and had been, it turned out, for longer than I had understood. What do you want? I asked. The question came out steadier than I felt. She was quiet for a moment, her thumb pressed once against the base of her glass, the same small gesture I had seen on the panel stage when she was formulating something. I want you to tell me why you haven't left, she said. 11 months in a firm where your work is unattributed and your access is limited. Why are you still there? Because leaving requires somewhere to go. Somewhere specific, she said. Yes. She nodded. That is honest. She picked up her glass again. I appreciate honesty. In this industry and in general, it is rarer than it should be. I looked at her. This is a professional conversation. She met my eyes. It is a conversation. She said it with a precision that made the 2 sentences different from each other in a way I felt rather than parsed. I am telling you what I have observed about your work because it is accurate and because you should know that someone outside of Theron Park's organizational preferences has noted it. What you do with that information is your own decision. The bartender came and refilled both glasses without being asked. I watched him go. Outside, through the narrow street-level window of the bar, I could see feet moving past on the pavement. The ordinary motion of the city outside this particular low-lit pocket of late afternoon. And the other part? I said. She did not ask which other part. She was quiet for 3 full seconds, which was, I was coming to understand, not empty time but the interval between deciding and speaking. That is also a conversation, she said. A different one. She looked at me with the directness that had been characteristic of her every word and movement since the pavement, undeflected and complete. Not a professional one, if you choose to have it. I thought about Dara, about the word complicated, about the accumulated experience of watching people navigate power differentials with insufficient preparation. I thought about the way her hand had felt at my waist on the sidewalk, and the word careful, and the specific texture of being seen by someone who does not look at things carelessly. I think, I said slowly, that I would need to know you better to have either conversation well. Something in her expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that a stranger would have noticed. But I had now spent enough hours studying her face that I caught it. A slight release of something that had been held very precisely in place. A fraction of warmth arriving into the composed landscape of her features. Then we continue the professional one tonight, she said, and take the other one at whatever speed makes sense. She picked up her glass. Tell me about the Meridian Annex, the projection model for thermal mass recalibration. Walk me through how you arrived at it. I looked at her. You read it closely enough to ask about thermal mass recalibration. I told you, I pay attention. I sat back in my chair and looked at this woman who had read 40 pages of my unattributed analytical work closely enough to ask a specific methodological question about it, who had noted the quality of my movement on a pavement, who had said my name twice with the care of someone storing something important, and who was now sitting in a quiet bar with her coat off and her collar open asking me to walk her through my thinking. All right, I said. She leaned forward slightly. The sconce light shifted across her face. I told her about the model, about the specific decision I had made to weight thermal mass cycles differently from the standard methodology, because standard methodology was built on assumptions about occupancy patterns that no longer matched how the buildings were actually being used. About the 3 weeks I had spent adjusting the projection ratios before I trusted the outputs enough to put them into the annex. I had never explained this to anyone at the firm because nobody had asked. Speaking it out loud in a room where someone was listening with genuine attention was a different experience from all the times I had worked it through in my own head. She asked questions. They were precise and excellent questions, the kind that required me to think rather than recap. She challenged one of my ratio assumptions, not dismissively, but in the specific way of someone who has seen a version of this problem from a different angle and wants to understand whether my angle accounts for it. I argued back. She listened. She nodded once. "That holds," she said. "I wanted to see if you'd defend it." She looked at me. "You do." I realize I've been talking for 40 minutes. 52, she said. She was looking at me with that expression again, the complete attentive warmth that she wore only when she had decided, apparently, that someone was worth wearing it in front of. I was aware of the hour, of the bar that had emptied a little more around us, of the small table between us and how much of it I had been leaning across without noticing. "I should go," I said, without moving. She did not tell me to stay. She looked at me steadily and said, "Your firm has a professional development presentation next Thursday. Theron Park's team, among others. I will be attending on behalf of Vale Capital. You're coming to our building." "Our building," she corrected, with a slight movement at the corner of her mouth. I looked at her. "Are you telling me that for professional reasons?" "Among others," she said again. I stood and put on my coat. She remained seated, watching me the way she watched everything, with complete attention and nothing wasted. At the table's edge I paused. "You said careful," I said, "the first time. On the sidewalk." "Yes." "What did you mean by it?" She looked at me for a long moment. The sconce light was very still. Outside, the city continued its motion. "What I said," she answered, "and also, what I didn't say." I held her gaze for one more second. Then I walked to the door and out onto the pavement and into the early evening air of a city that looked exactly the same as it always did and felt entirely different, the way a place feels when something in you has changed and the world has not caught up yet. I walked 2 blocks before I pulled out my phone, then I put it away again, because she had told me twice to look up from it, and I was beginning to understand that she meant it as more than navigation advice. Dara was still at her desk when I got back. She took one look at me and said nothing, which was the most information-dense silence she had ever produced. I sat down. I pulled up the Meridian file. Then I did something I had not done in 11 months. I opened a fresh document and started writing a methodology note addressed to no one. Just me, thinking clearly, in a register I had not allowed myself since I got here. The following Thursday arrived weighted. I was in the office at 7:30. Dara arrived at 8 and assessed the situation in one look. "You changed your shirt twice this morning." I did not, I stopped. Dara's observational capabilities were something I had learned to accept without demanding explanation. "She's coming at 11, Dara said. She paused. "Ren." "I know." "Do you actually know?" "She is the most powerful person who has ever walked through this firm's doors," Dara said. "I have complete information. I am not operating under any illusions." She looked at me. "Then what are you doing?" "I'm going to a professional development presentation," I said. Dara picked up her coffee. "Sure you are." The presentation was in the main conference room. 7 people from the firm were presenting. I was not one of them. I sat at the end of the observer chairs with the folder of backup documentation nobody ever asked for, the way I always did, and I waited. She came in at 11:02 with a woman who carried a leather notebook and wrote continuously without looking up. Soline carried nothing. Black jacket over a deep blue blouse, hair pinned, a pen tucked into the knot of it filed by my mind with the thoroughness of something that should not matter as much as it does. Theron Park shook her hand with the deference of a man performing the appropriate amount of impressed. She received it with professional neutrality. The other partners introduced themselves. She acknowledged each one by name, having prepared in advance because she prepared everything. Then she looked across the room and found me at the end of the observer row. Her expression did not change, but she looked. That was enough. The presentation began. It was competent. I watched the projected slides with the dual attention of someone who had built them and someone watching them be used. It was 11 months of the same thing, a room with low ceilings that I had been told was the right size. Soline asked 3 questions during the first section. They were excellent questions, which I had expected. The third question was about the Meridian retrofit projection model, specifically about the thermal mass recalibration methodology. She directed it at Theron's senior associate who had presented that section. He gave a reasonable answer. He was a smart man, and he understood the model well enough to discuss it. But I saw the moment where the explanation became general, where it stepped back from the specific reasoning and into the territory of, I believe the methodology accounts for those variables, yes. Solen let the answer finish. She nodded. Then she said, without inflection or directed accusation, does anyone in the room have a more detailed account of the decision-making behind that ratio weighting? Theron looked at his senior associate. His senior associate looked at his materials. I had not planned to speak. What happened instead was that 11 months of silence, 11 months of materials prepared and not attributed and presented by people who knew them less well than I did, came to a specific and precise end. I said, I can. Everyone in the room turned. Theron's expression was surprise, compounded with something not entirely welcome. His senior associate looked at me as someone not sure whether they were being rescued or undermined. The other people in the room looked at me the way people look at unexpected variables. Solen Vielle looked at me the way she always looked at me, which was with complete attention and nothing wasted. And for 1 second, the room contracted to just the two of us, and the space between her question and my answer. Go ahead, she said. I spoke for 8 minutes. I did not look at my notes because I did not need them. I explained the ratio decision, the occupancy pattern data that had made standard methodology insufficient, the 3-week adjustment period and what it had produced. I answered the follow-up question she asked, and I answered it correctly, and I knew it was correct, and she knew it was correct, and the room understood something had shifted without being entirely sure what. When I finished, Solen said, thank you. 2 words, the same precision as always. But in the pause after them, before Theron smoothed things over with a comment about the depth of his team's research process, there was a fraction of a second where she looked at me with that expression from the bar, warmth moving through the composure, present underneath the surface without announcing itself. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. People dispersed. I gathered the backup folder that nobody had asked for and moved toward the door. Theron stopped me in the corridor. His expression was difficult to read. He said, good intervention in there, and did not say anything else, which told me that he understood it had been my work and had decided in real time that the professional calculation came out neutral rather than positive or negative. I nodded and moved on. In the elevator lobby, I found Solené standing apart from her colleague, who was on a phone call near the window. She was looking at her phone, and then she was looking at me. The elevator opened. I stepped toward it. Ren, she said. I stopped. She glanced toward her colleague, then back at me. She took 2 steps closer. Her voice was lower than it had been in the conference room, different in register, the way a room sounds different with the acoustics changed. Saturday morning, she said. There is a market on Montrose Street that I attend for approximately 1 hour every week for reasons that have nothing to do with work. She looked at me with that complete, steady attention. If you happen to be in the area, I looked at her. Is this a professional conversation? The corner of her mouth moved. No. The elevator door began to close. I caught it. Saturday, I said. She nodded once. The way she nodded at things she had already decided. I got in the elevator. The doors closed. I thought about the word careful and what she had said about it, what she said and what she didn't, and the gap between those 2 things, the size and shape of something I had been moving toward since a Wednesday morning on a pavement with a coffee cup rolling toward the storm drain. I was careful with it. I held it. I did not take it apart in the elevator or in the lobby or in the walk home through the early November air. I was careful with it the way she had been careful with me, which was to say I gave it the full weight of my attention and did not pretend it was smaller than it was. Saturday was 5 days away. I counted them. The Montrose Street Market was one of those small, determined pockets that should not have survived this city and had anyway. 3 blocks of flowers and cheese and old men arguing about bread, Saturday mornings under a partial canopy that sagged in one corner for 4 years without anyone addressing it. I arrived at 8:15, early enough to seem intentional but not so early that a stranger might read the hour in my face. I had been awake since 6:15. I did not examine this. I had in fact been awake since 6:15. I did not examine this closely. I bought coffee from a cart with a hand-lettered sign reading, Best in the City on warped cardboard. The coffee was excellent. I stood with it and looked at the market the way I had learned, lately, to look at things that mattered, which was to say I looked up. I did not see her for 11 minutes, long enough to begin questioning whether I had misunderstood the invitation. Then I saw her at a stall near the far end of the second block, standing in front of dried herbs and preserved things, and she was alone. No driver, no colleague, no security detail, just a woman in a dark coat with her hands in her pockets, bending slightly to read a label on a jar of something dark and preserved, with her hair down and one side tucked behind her ear, and the morning light doing something entirely unfair with the angle of her jaw. I walked toward her. She sensed my approach before I was close enough to speak. She straightened and turned, and there was that quality again, the absence of surprise, the quality of someone confirming a calculation that had already been run. "You came," she said. "I said I would. People often say things," she said. She said it without cynicism, more as information about the world she operated in, a world where the gap between what people said and what they did was wide enough to have become simply part of the terrain. "I'm not most people," I said. "No," she said. She said it with a quiet conviction that settled between us before she turned back to the stall. "I know that already." We walked the market. She looked at things with attention, and I walked beside her, and we talked the way we had in the bar, direct, in all directions. She said what she observed, asked what she wanted to know, did not circle things. She listened with a completeness I understood was not a performance. When I spoke, she received it without deciding in advance which parts were relevant. We stopped at a stall selling prints from a young illustrator, and I stood for a long time in front of one particular piece, a drawing of a building from an angle that emphasized structure over aesthetics, the bones of the thing visible in a way the architect had probably not intended as the selling point. "That one," Soleni said. I was thinking the same thing. "It's the load distribution. She made it beautiful." The illustrator, a woman in her mid-20s with paint on her jacket sleeve, and the look of someone who had been there since 6 in the cold, glanced up. "You're the first person today who said that word." "What word?" "Load. Everyone else says composition." I smiled. "It is composition. It's just load distribution that makes the composition possible." The illustrator looked at me and then at Solene and then back at me. She wrapped the print in brown paper without asking if I wanted it. I bought it. When we moved on, Solene said, "You see structures the way I see contracts." "How do you see contracts?" "From the inside out. What holds it together before what it looks like from the outside." I thought about that. We were at the market's third block now, the canopy overhead, and the morning had warmed slightly, the way November mornings sometimes do, unexpectedly, deciding against the cold for a few hours. "Why do you come here?" I asked. "Every week." She was quiet for a moment. Not evasively quiet. The quiet of someone locating the honest answer rather than the easy one. "Because it is the 1 hour where I am not required to be Solene Vael," she said. "Nobody here needs anything from me. The man who sells the preserved lemons has been selling me the same jar every Saturday for 3 years without once asking my name." She paused. "I find that extraordinarily restoring." I looked at her. "You've been coming alone for 3 years." "Yes." She said it without any particular quality attached to it. Not self-pity, not defiance. It was simply true. "And now?" I said. She looked at me sideways. The morning light caught the fine lines at the corners of her eyes. Something was happening in her expression, moving under the composure, the way things move beneath still water, visible to someone watching closely and not visible to anyone not watching at all. "Now it is different," she said. We walked back to the first block. She bought the preserved lemons, as she apparently did every Saturday, from a man who handed them over with the ease of a long habit and did not ask her name. She paid in cash. I noted this without commenting on it. At the edge of the market, where the canopy ended and the open street resumed, we stopped. The morning had the feeling of something that was about to become ordinary, and both of us were aware that it was not ordinary yet and should not be rushed into ordinary before it was ready. "I have a question," I said. She waited. "At the conference, when you asked about the thermal mass methodology, were you doing that for me?" She looked at me for a moment. The question hung there, entirely honest, requiring an entirely honest answer, and she gave it. "Yes," she said. "So, you gave me the opening. You were already going to take it." She said it without qualification. "You had been sitting in that room for 40 minutes holding information that was yours and waiting for permission you were not going to receive from anyone in that room except from me. I gave you the door. You walked through it. Those are different things." I thought about that. I thought about the 11 months and the observer chair and the folder nobody asked for. "What happens now?" I said. "Professionally." She turned slightly to face the street. Her coat collar was turned up against the November air, and she had one hand in her pocket and the other holding the jar of preserved lemons, and she looked, for the first time since I had known her, the way people look when they are standing in front of a decision they have already made but have not yet spoken aloud. "My firm is completing its review of the Midtown Development portfolio," she said. "The acquisition of the firm on floors 20 through 23 will close within 60 days. As part of the portfolio consolidation, Vael Capital will be establishing an internal advisory team for sustainable materials analysis on 3 major retrofit projects in the new year." She paused. "The lead analyst position has not been filled." I stared at her. "You're offering me a job." "I am telling you that the position exists. and that the analytical framework I have seen from you is the framework that position requires. She met my eyes. What you do with that information is your decision. I thought about Dara, about the low ceilings, about 11 months of preparing materials for other people's rooms. And the other part, I said, not the professional conversation. Something moved in her face, unhurried and direct, the way she did everything. She looked at me the way she had looked at me in the bar, not managing the expression, not applying the professional neutrality that was her default in every other context, just fully, openly present. I have been careful with people, she said, for a long time. I am careful because when I stopped being careful once, it was costly, in ways I did not fully recover from for several years. I am telling you this because you should know it, not because it is a reason to stop. She paused. You make being careful feel like the wrong economy. I held that. The November air moved around us and the market continued behind us with its ordinary morning sounds, and I stood with the weight of what she had just said and understood that she did not say things she did not mean any more than I did. I'm not asking you to stop being careful, I said. I know. I'm asking you to be careful with me, not instead of with. She looked at me for a long moment. The preserved lemons jar caught the light. A dog being walked by a man in a yellow jacket passed between us and the curb, and neither of us moved. That, she said quietly, is exactly the distinction I needed someone to make. I laughed. It came out warm and a little unsteady, the laugh of someone who had been holding attention for long enough that the release of it was slightly too large for a single breath. She watched me laugh with an expression that did what her expressions rarely did, which was to open, fully, without the careful architecture that usually held it in place. She reached across the small distance between us and pressed her fingertips briefly against the back of my hand, not holding it, not taking it, just the briefest, deliberate contact, a point of arrival. Saturday next week, she said. Not the market. Dinner. At my apartment. So, there is no bar closing time and no professional context and nothing to navigate except the conversation itself. Yes, I said. She nodded. Then she walked to the car at the curb, got in, and the door closed with the quiet efficiency of a life that ran on precision. I stood on the pavement with a wrapped print under my arm and the ghost of her fingertips on my hand, and I looked up. The November sky was that undecided gray, not threatening and not beautiful, making space for whatever came next. Whatever came next was 2 weeks of the most precise and careful thing I have ever been part of in my life. She did not rush it, neither did I. The dinner the following Saturday was at her apartment, 11th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, 2 walls of books organized according to a system that had clearly taken hours. She cooked without ceremony, the way she did most things, with full attention and an absence of visible effort that meant the effort was already incorporated into the approach. We ate at the window with the city below and talked for 4 hours. I asked her about the one time she had stopped being careful, and she told me, a woman at 33, a partner at another firm, a relationship built on the premise that proximity was the same as intimacy. When the carved-out spaces became unsustainable, they had nothing underneath. It cost her a year of her capacity for trust. She told me this without the edited version, and I understood she was giving me the actual thing. I told her about my last relationship, which ended when I was 24. He had found my intensity interesting for 8 months and exhausting for 4. The worst part was realizing I had spent the final months managing myself down to a size he could tolerate, having imported the compression from professional contexts without noticing. Solane listened to all of it. She said, that is a very recognizable failure mode for someone who is significantly better at their work than the environment they are in. I looked at her. She said, you learn to compress because compression is what the space demands, and then you compress everywhere because the habit gets ahead of the context. Yes, I said. Exactly that. She nodded. She picked up her wine glass and turned it once, the same gesture I had seen at the bar when she was thinking. Then she said, I want you to stop compressing around me. I am telling you this now, before anything, because it will be easier to establish than to correct. All right, I said. She looked at me. That answer came very easily. I've been waiting for someone to say that for 2 years. Something moved across her face that I was beginning to recognize as the expression that arrived when something landed precisely in the place she had not guarded because she had not expected anything to reach it. She looked at the table for a moment, then back at me. Then we have that much less to navigate, she said. The weeks that followed had a quality I had not had before. Not frictionless 2 people learning which protective patterns had served them and which were habit, the professional friction of my repositioned situation, the power differential I chose not to minimize. She was 41 and ran a capital group. I was 26 and had spent 11 months being invisible. These facts existed. We talked about them. She would not let important things become unspoken. She initiated the conversation about the power differential on the third dinner before I had gotten there myself, and she said it plainly. The gap between our professional positions is real. I need someone who will disagree with me when I am wrong. I need someone who will not manage their responses based on what they think I want. The version of that dynamic where someone makes themselves small around me is not the one I want. I said, I have extensive practice at not doing that. She almost smiled. I know you do. I've been watching your work for 4 weeks. I shook my head. You are the most unusual person I have ever met. I have been told that, she said. It is not always meant as a compliment. I mean it as one. She looked at me. I know that too. Then one Tuesday in the 3rd week, Dara called me away from my desk in the middle of the afternoon and closed the door to the small meeting room and sat across from me with an expression that was the compound of several things. Concern and something that looked like preemptive regret. Word has gotten to the partners, she said. About what? That you and Selene Vielle have been seen, twice outside the building. There's a photo, she said. Not a press photo. Someone with a phone. From the market last Saturday. I looked at her. Dara set her phone face up on the table. The photo was from distance, taken from the market entrance, blurred slightly by zoom. It showed 2 women standing close together at the edge of a canopy. One of them with dark shoulder-length hair and a coat. One of them with a wrapped print under her arm. It was not unambiguous. It was not nothing. Theron saw it, Dara said. It's been shared in the partners channel. I looked at the photo for a long moment. The quality of the moment it had captured was correct. We had been close. I had been looking at her. She had been looking at me. What are they saying? Dara folded her hands. The official version is concerned about the firm's position during the acquisition review. The real version is that Theron is worried you have a relationship with the woman who can decide whether this firm survives the next 60 days. And he knows, she said carefully, that the Meridian work is yours, which he has been committed to not knowing officially for 11 months. Now he has to decide how much of that he keeps not knowing. The arithmetic of that landed clearly. If Theron acknowledged the work was mine, he had to acknowledge 11 months of attributing it incorrectly. If he did not acknowledge it, he had to continue the fiction in a context where the fiction was becoming visible. Does he want to speak to me? He wants you to understand, Dara said, choosing the words with the precision of someone navigating a thing that is not clean, that any personal matters involving parties in a current acquisition review should be managed carefully. That is not an instruction. That is a threat made to sound like advice. She held my gaze. Yes. I thought about Selene saying I need someone who will disagree with me when I am wrong. I thought about what she had said about the lead analyst position. I thought about the observer chair. Tell Theron I appreciate the communication, I said, and that I'll be in touch about my availability for the Meridian follow-up presentation in December. Dara looked at me. That's not the response he's expecting. I know. She picked up her phone. Then she said very quietly, for the record, you should go wherever the work gets to actually be yours. She paused. Regardless of everything else. Just that part. You should go where the work gets to be yours. I looked at her. I knew that she was saying this specifically and deliberately, and that it cost her something to say it. She had been there 4 years. She had the posture of someone who had learned to take up exactly the amount of space that was offered. She was brilliant and exhausted, and she was telling me, in the clearest way she could, to do the thing she had not done. Thank you, I said. She nodded. She stood up. She opened the door. She went back to her desk and pulled up a spreadsheet and did not say anything else, which was the loudest thing she had ever communicated. That evening, I texted Selene, not about work. I sent her a photograph I had taken at the market, a picture of the leaning corner of the canopy, the one that had been sagging for 4 years, taken from below so the sky beyond it was visible. I had taken it that morning before she arrived, walking through early, because the angle had caught my eye. She replied 4 minutes later, "That is an excellent photograph." Then, after a pause, "Dinner tomorrow. I have something I need to tell you." I held the phone and thought about the photo that had been taken of us and the partners channel and Theron's careful management of what he knew and did not know. "All right," I replied. The something she needed to tell me was this. The acquisition had accelerated. The firm on floors 20 through 23 was closing 2 weeks earlier than projected, which meant the portfolio consolidation timeline had moved and the internal advisory team structure was being formalized within 30 days rather than 60. The lead analyst position needed to be filled on a compressed schedule. She told me this at the table by the window, the city below. The same wine she had opened the first dinner because she had noted that I liked it and bought a case of it, which was the most pragmatic, romantic gesture I had ever encountered. She told me directly, as she told me everything, without softening or embellishment. "And there is the photo," I said. She nodded. "My assistant flagged it this morning." She was quiet for a moment. I did not expect it to become visible this quickly. Are you concerned? She turned her glass. The familiar habit of thinking. I am concerned about one specific thing. She looked at me. My concern is not about us. She said the word without hesitation, and hearing it spoken with that flatness, that simple, factual inclusion of us as a thing that existed, did something to my chest I chose not to analyze at the table. My concern is that the timing creates a circumstance where you may feel the position is connected to the personal. I need the professional decision to be a professional decision. They are separate, I said. Are they? I looked at her. The thermal mass methodology, the meridian annex, the 40 pages that 3 senior consultants called novel before they knew who wrote them. That work exists independently of you. You did not create it. You found it. She held my gaze. Yes. So the professional decision is about whether I want to be in a context where my work gets to be mine. That answer is not complicated. And the other decision, she said. I looked at her steadily. I'm already in that. Her breath changed. Barely. Just the slightest alteration in the rhythm of it. The kind of thing that is invisible unless you have been watching someone carefully for weeks and have learned the texture of their composure. I had been watching. I saw it. She set her glass down. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at me. I have been very careful for a long time, she said slowly. What I did not tell you is that I had begun to believe that version of careful was simply who I was now, that it had become structural rather than protective. She looked at me with the full directness she reserved for the things that mattered. And then a woman I had not expected walked into a path I use every day and spilled coffee on my coat and argued about occupancy pattern data in a quiet bar, and I found that the structure had a door in it I had stopped remembering was there. I was not going to be able to maintain my composure through that sentence. I knew this, and I did not try. What I did instead was reach across the table and put my hand over hers, the way she had put her fingertips against the back of my hand at the market, deliberate and unhurried and without ambiguity. She looked at our hands, then at me. The composure was still there, the bones of it, but it was inhabited differently now, warmer, more complete. I told you on the sidewalk, she said, the first time. You told me to look up from my phone. I told you to be careful. She paused. What I meant was the other thing. I understand what you meant now. Yes, she said. I think you did then too. I laughed. It came out quiet and warm, and she watched it happen with that expression she had, the one she wore only with me, open and unmanaged and more real than anything. I put the position informally next week, she said. My assistant will send you the documentation. You review it with your own legal counsel, no one connected to either firm. You accept or decline on your own timeline, on your own terms, and neither answer changes this. She looked at me with the directness that never faltered. I want that stated clearly. Stated clearly, I said. She turned her hand beneath mine so that instead of covering it, she was holding it. Her fingers were cool and her grip was exactly what I had expected from her, neither tentative nor excessive, just present. And now, she said, I would like to stop discussing work. I looked at her. What would you like to discuss instead? You, she said, specifically the fact that you have been sitting on that side of the table for 3 dinners and I would prefer you on this side. I held her gaze. That is the most direct thing you have said to me. I have been building to it, she said. She said it with the slight movement at the corner of her mouth that I had come to understand was her version of a laugh given architectural form, contained and real and only visible to someone paying attention. I stood. I moved around the table. She turned her chair slightly and I sat beside her, and she looked at me for a moment in the different quality of close proximity, the way space between 2 people changes when there is no longer a table between them, and I thought about the sidewalk and the hand at my waist and the word, careful, and everything it had contained that she had not yet said aloud, and was now in the process of saying in a different register. She lifted her hand and touched my face, her palm against my jaw, cool and deliberate and absolute. You walked into my path, she said. I have been thinking about what to call that. What have you decided? Her thumb moved once against the line of my jaw, slow and precise. The city hummed below the window. The wine was untouched on the table behind us. Fortunate, she said. Simply that. When she kissed me, it was not tentative. There was nothing in it of uncertainty or apology. She kissed me the way she argued and the way she thought, with complete attention and nothing held back, and I made a sound against her mouth that I did not try to silence because she had asked me not to compress, and I was not going to compress. She pulled back just far enough to look at me, and the expression on her face was the one I had been watching move toward the surface for weeks. Unheld now, just there. I've been wanting to do that since the pavement, I said. So have I, she said. Longer than was professional. I laughed. The laugh echoed against the window glass, and she kissed me again, less careful this time, and I understood that the careful had been preparation, not character, and the character was this, warm and direct and present. And when we finally sat back from each other, the city was darker below the window and neither of us had looked at it for a long time. We stayed at the table until the bottle was empty and midnight had arrived. She told me about the coastline she grew up on, a town where family money had opinions, and she had spent her 20s proving those opinions wrong. I told her about the internship summer where I had taught myself the methodology I later spent 11 months being invisible for. She said, I know. I read the methodology note you wrote after the presentation. The one that wasn't addressed to anyone. You left it open on your screen. I stared at her. You saw my screen. You were in the elevator lobby. The screen faced the corridor. She said it without apology. I read 3 paragraphs. I walked away. What did you think? She looked at me across the table. I think you have been operating at approximately 40% of what you are capable of for 11 months, and the other 60% has been accumulating somewhere, and I would very much like to be in proximity when it comes forward. I looked at her. You have a remarkable way of saying things. I say what I mean, she said. I have found it saves considerable time. The official offer documentation arrived in my personal email on Monday morning, sent from Solange's assistant to the address she had asked me to provide, an address unconnected to the firm. I read it twice at my kitchen table with my coffee before opening my laptop to look at it properly. It was a real offer, a real position, with real scope, on real projects, with my name on every piece of work that came from it. The compensation was almost disorienting after 11 months of $40 a month to spare. I sent it to a lawyer I knew from university who did employment contracts and told her I needed a review with no firm connections and complete discretion. She called me back in 2 hours. She said, "This is a serious offer." She said, "Whoever put this together was very careful about ensuring it couldn't be read as contingent on anything except your professional qualifications." She said, "The only question is whether you want to do it." "I want to do it," I said. "Then do it." I handed in my notice to Theron Park on Wednesday. His expression moved through 3 stages: surprise, which was genuine, calculation, which was professional, and something underneath both of those that might, in another context, have been called regret. Not regret about the notice. Regret that he had spent 11 months not seeing what was in front of him, and that the consequence of that was now standing in his office holding a resignation letter. He said, "I hope you know what you're doing." "I do," I said, "for the first time in about a year." He nodded. He did not ask me to reconsider. He knew better. Dara was at her desk when I came out. She looked at the letter and then at me, and her face did the thing it almost never did, which was to show everything at once. She stood up and hugged me, fast and firm, the hug of someone who had been waiting to do it for a while. "You're going to be extraordinary," she said into my shoulder. "You already are," I told her. "Whatever room you're in." She stepped back. Her eyes were bright. She sat back down. She opened her spreadsheet. She did not look at me again because she was not going to cry at her desk on a Wednesday afternoon, and I understood and respected that completely. I walked out of the building for the last time on a Friday in late November. The sidewalk was the same sidewalk. The corner cart was there. I bought a coffee. I stood for a moment at the spot where the black sedan had been parked, the spot where I had stepped into Solange's path 5 weeks ago and changed the coordinates of my life without understanding at the time that that was what I was doing. I looked up. The sky above the Midtown Towers was that particular color it gets in November, just before the first real cold arrives. Not gray, not blue, something in between, honest and clear and making no promises about the weather. My phone buzzed. A text from Solange. 1 line. "Are you looking up?" I laughed. A full real laugh on a Midtown pavement with a coffee in my hand and no particular requirement to be anywhere for the next 3 days before my new position started. I typed back, "Yes." She replied, "Good, I'll see you tonight." I held the phone for a moment. I thought about the word careful and everything it had contained and everything it had become. I put the phone in my pocket. I walked. The months that followed were not uncomplicated. There was the adjustment at Vail Capital, learning the culture and pace of an environment where extraordinary was the floor. There was the adjustment to being seen, to my name on work, to presenting in rooms rather than sitting at the wall. I had thought the transition would feel like relief. It felt more like learning to stand upright after years of holding a different posture. The body remembers compression, and it takes time to release it fully. The work itself was the best of it. 3 retrofit projects with scope large enough to require the methodology I had developed and push it in directions I had not yet tested. The specific pleasure of a mind encountering a problem large enough to require its full range was something I had not felt at full volume in over a year. And there was Solange. The relationship had a quality I had not had before, being held without being contained. She was precise and demanding and direct in ways that required me to match her, which meant knowing what I thought and saying it clearly. That discipline was not always comfortable, but it was always real. She made space for my thinking rather than shaping it. She disagreed with me frequently and followed the disagreement all the way through. When she was wrong, she said so. I watched it cost her something each time, and she paid anyway. She was not easy, neither was I. There were evenings where she came home with a sharpness that had nothing to do with me, and I had to learn the difference between the sharpness that required response and the sharpness that simply required presence. There were mornings where I was deep in a problem and unreachable, and she learned to read that and to leave me there without taking the absence personally, which she told me was not her natural instinct and which she chose anyway. We chose it. That was the thing I kept coming back to as the weeks became months and the pattern of us settled into itself. We chose it deliberately, repeatedly, with the full knowledge of what each of us was and what each of us had been, and with no illusion that choosing it once was sufficient. I kept the print from the market. It hung in the office space I had been given at Vail Capital, the print of the building from the angle that showed its load distribution, the one I had bought from the illustrator with paint on her jacket sleeve. Solane had looked at it once, early on, and said, "You chose that for the structure." "I chose it because the structure was what made the beauty possible," I said. She had looked at me then with an expression I had not seen before and have not stopped thinking about since. The expression of someone encountering a sentence that said something they had been trying to articulate for years without finding the words. She did not say anything. She just looked. And then she crossed the room and put one hand at my waist, the way she had on the sidewalk on that first morning, and held me there, and I leaned back against her and looked at the print on the wall, and we were quiet together in the way of people who have arrived somewhere that neither of them fully expected to reach. I thought about the pavement, about the coffee cup going sideways, about the quality of her eyes in the moment she looked down at me and the single word she had said, which had contained everything it turned out she meant, all the attention and the intention and the careful, long-accumulated recognition of something worth being careful with. "Careful," I said, out loud, without context. She pressed her hand slightly more firmly at my waist. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." And the city moved below us, and the work was real, and the love was real, and the structure held.